What's going on, everyone? And welcome to another episode of Writing Friction. And as always, today's guest is pretty cool. Everyone say hello to Mark Greaney. How are you, Mark?
I'm doing great, Michael. How you doing?
Not too bad. Where are we hunkering down right now? We're still in the apocalypse, I think.
I know I'm still hunkering down. I had a book that came out around this time last year, and I had a normal tour. And then a couple of weeks later, everything shut down. I was like, "Wow, I'm so lucky that I had my tour." And here we are a year later, and I'm hunkered down like everyone else. I'm in Memphis, Tennessee, where I live.
Okay. Two quick questions. First, were you able to finish that whole tour?
Yeah. That tour was like the last couple of weeks of February. I
Yeah.
even did I went to like a writers or like a book fair in early March, and that was my last foray out into the world.
Yeah, no,
Since.
for sure. Was that your first book tour? Are you a veteran of the book tour world? I've
I'm
been
a
a touring musician forever, so I know the road.
Okay, yeah. Well, I was a touring musician back in the '80s, if you can believe that, and not very successfully,
What
but
did you
yeah,
play? What do you play?
I play drums. I have drums. I don't play them like I used to. That's for sure.
Sure. Yeah, yeah,
Yeah. So yeah, no, I've been a published author for 12 years, and I've been doing the tours virtually that entire length of time, and I've done about two books a year, virtually every year. So I've spent a lot of time, out there. This is weird doing it from home, but
yeah.
there's definitely some benefits to it, obviously.
Yeah, it's interesting. I play guitar, and I've been, like I said, I'm 33, but I've been playing in bands since I was 13.
Yeah.
So it's gonna be interesting when I get on a stage again, just
Hmm.
to feel what it's like to even just see people in front of me.
Yeah, I know. Yeah.
I gotta ask, what kind of tours were you doing with your band? What kind of music was it?
Well, we were a band like a lot of bands in the mid '80s that was like wanted to be hard rock but wanted to play. So we did like college rock and stuff like
Yeah,
that.
yeah, yeah,
So, when we were jamming, we would do a lot of Nugent or a Deep Purple, and then when we play live, it was a lot of REM
yeah.
and The Cure and stuff
Without a
like
doubt.
that. But I really enjoyed it, and I'm glad it happened to me. It feels like a completely different life. I bought a set of Roland electronic drums last year. I was all excited to get back into it,
Yeah, yeah,
and
yeah.
it's just more frustrating than anything else because you know what you used to be able to do, and it's not like riding a bike. You don't just sit back down and start, feeling the same grooves or whatever. So,
Oh, no
uh,
way. Especially,
yeah, it's
especially with drums. I mean, this is totally off the topic of a book podcast, but
it's okay.
and people might tune out right now. But for people who don't
Nah,
know, Phil Collins, who I think is one of the greatest drummers of all
yeah,
time, original
yeah,
drummer of Genesis.
yeah.
I don't know how old he is now. He's probably well into his 70s.
Right.
He has been publicly trying to get back into drums, and he's been posting videos of his progress, like he's walking up like on a walker to the drum set, and then he
Yeah.
like 30 minutes. Drumming is a different than guitar playing. It's taking your
Mm,
whole body. It's a whole different thing,
yeah.
for sure.
Yeah.
So were
Yeah.
you guys? I'm sorry.
I was just going to say, like my right hand and my left leg used to sort of work independently of each other, and it was
Yeah.
kind of like magic, or my right leg,
Yeah.
and then that doesn't happen anymore.
So was this band in Tennessee where you grew up? Is that where you're from? Is that your origins?
Yeah. We played in several states around, mostly colleges or really awful bars
Yeah.
who really didn't want to hear REM, but we
Yeah.
we we needed a booking, so that's what
Yeah.
we
Yeah.
did.
So were you doing any writing back then, or did writing kind of come to you later on?
No, I was a big reader, and I didn't even know I wanted to be a writer. But I just got obsessed with reading novels, and the first novel I ever bought was Patriot Games by Tom Clancy, coincidentally, and I just became obsessed with that genre, reading, and then I got an idea when I was about 22
Mhm.
for a book to write on my own. And it took me 15 years to finish it, but I did finish it. I mean, it was just that thing that was just there, that you told yourself was going to be awesome someday. And I finished it and immediately shelved it and wrote something else. And my second book took me like 7 months to write, because once you've done it, you're like, okay, how much was I actually working, and how much was I talking about it or thinking about it or procrastinating. And it's like when it's done, it feels pretty good, and it also feels doable. It's like I just pulled this off. So I did another one in 7 months, and it ended up being my fourth book that I finished was the first book that I had published. So I didn't get published till I was 42, and I, got the desire to be a writer when I was 22.
So that's a lot of time. What are you doing in that time? For instance, I'm 33. I started writing 3 or 4 years ago. I
Right.
published a novella and I'm about to finish my first novel. I own a dog walking business.
Uh-huh.
What did you do for 20 years while you were writing those first 2 books?
Well, I graduated from college with a BA in poli-sci and international relations, and then I worked in restaurants
Yeah.
a lot. That's how I used my poli-sci.
Did you stay in Tennessee the whole time?
Yeah, almost the whole time. I got into sort of international sales, and I lived in Miami for a while.
Oh, okay.
I traveled overseas a good bit, and I was actually most recently in the medical device industry. I worked for 9 years in like sort of international customer support for a company called Medtronic here in Memphis. And that whole time I was, secretly writing books and trying to get published and everything. And it finally happened, and I quit my job in April of 2009.
So, I mean, again, I was talking about before the podcast, but it seems like you and I kind of running similar paths. At least I'm at least a little behind you, right? But that being said, when you said you were kind of writing in secret, were you writing in the morning, writing at night? Did you have a wife and kids? Were you able to have that time?
So I didn't at that time. I lived alone, and I had to be at work at 8 in the morning.
Yeah.
And The Gray Man, which is my first novel that was published, that book was 100% written between July and December of 2007, between 5:30 a.m. and 7:30 a.m. at Starbucks. It was like every morning I was really tired. I didn't want to get up, but I made myself, and then I go to Starbucks. And then there's something, and you probably know this too, as you balance a real job with writing. There's something about just having a block of time, like 1 hour or 2 hours, and that's all you've got for the day, and that really focuses you and helps you a lot. Once I became a full-time author, it took me just as long to write a book as it did before, when I had a 24-hour day at my disposal. Having those 2 hours early in the morning really worked for me. And now I have 3 stepchildren and a wife. And so it's the day doesn't start as early as it used to, but I do this full time, and my 20th book is the one that's coming out right now. So I kind of have an understanding on how to make it work.
Yeah, I mean, an author like you fascinates me, right? Because most of the authors I talk to on the podcast, there's 5 years between books they write.
Yeah.
And there's authors like you who are just, I prefer to just banging this shit out, right?
Yeah.
And it's not, I'm not too familiar with you. You mentioned Tom Clancy. I haven't read too much of that stuff. My father will read it all. He's read all of it. I've always been more of like the Philip Roth deep shit. But that irregardless of that, did you know you wanted to? You said that Tom Clancy was the first book you read. When you first started writing, those 20 years kind of developing your skill, were you specifically thinking, I want to write like this, let's just say like Tom Clancy? Did you have that style? Were you aiming for that specifically?
Well, as I said, I read a ton of novels, and I always had this credo, and I was not a particularly mature guy in his 20s by any stretch of the imagination. But I look back on this, and I'm so glad that I had this sort of like this feeling that what I needed to do was, I wanted to be a writer, but I loved reading books, and I never wanted to stop loving books. So I wasn't going to sit there and analyze and diagram and try and replicate and figure out what happens here in the third act turn and all these things that I barely understand in the first place. I just wanted to read for pleasure.
Yes.
And so many things that I've tried in life, I've fallen on my face and, failed at. So this isn't like, this manifest destiny that I was, definitely going to do this, but I just kept at it because I like to do it. And I wasn't trying to write like Tom Clancy or like Nelson DeMille or any of the Ken Follett or anybody that I really, really liked. Just, I think, a little bit of osmosis. You spend enough time in those books, and that informs your style a little bit.
Yeah.
That's the only thing that makes sense to me, because I never studied writing. I never took classes or anything like that.
So same with me. So you're working in the medical device field. You're writing at Starbucks. What was the first book you said that got published?
Yeah, it was called The Gray Man, which is the first one in a series. My new book, Relentless, is the 10th book in the series. So
Okay.
that was that was the first one.
So can you talk about how that happened? I mean, were you querying everything you were writing? I mean, was that, you said that was the fourth thing you wrote, but first to get published?
Yeah, I queried like the last three. So basically what I did was I finished my first book, as I said, that took me 15 years.
Yeah.
And then, the internet had been invented in the time it took me to write that book. Okay. So there was answers to all the questions that I didn't have answers to when the 15 years I was working on it.
Yeah.
So I went on the internet and I was like, how to get your book published. And first I saw that I made tremendous mistakes. The book was too long. I had way too many characters. I look back at it now, and although I'm super proud of the story and would love for it to come out in a completely different form, I just kind of like laugh at some rookie mistakes. The good thing is, and I always tell this to authors, is like, your book doesn't get published, that doesn't mean it was a failure. You are, whether you know it or not, once you dust yourself back off, you're so much better as a writer than you were. And you talked about writing novellas. I was having the hardest time finishing that book for 15 years that at one point I just had an idea for another story, and I wrote it as a novella right in the middle of it. And that gives you a beginning, a middle, an end, something to edit, something completely finished. You probably talk to authors that want to be published like I do, and they'll be like, yeah, I'm working on like 5 different things. And I'm like, what you're telling me is you're writing the easy shit of those 5 different things. And every time you hit a speed bump, it's like you're moving on to something else. It's like, but with a novella, it's a contained, like mine was, I did 3, they were about 25,000 words, and they were, it exercises all the things you have to be good at to be published as a novel. So that was a great experience for me.
Yeah.
But going back to your question, in 2005, after I'd finished my first book and I was working on my second book, the internet had been invented again. And I just saw that you're supposed to get an agent. I didn't even know how that worked or what you did. I thought you just mailed the whole book into a publishing house, and if they liked it, they sent you money. I didn't know. And I wish it was like that. But I looked up who the agent was of like one of my favorite authors who was not a household name, because I figured I wasn't going to get John Grisham's agent or whatever. So I wanted someone who wrote in my genre, who was really, really good, because to me, an agent, represents clients who, with talent, not just, to make money.
Yeah.
And so there was an author named Ralph Peters, who, again, not a household name, but fantastic author in my genre. So I looked to see who his agent was, and his name was Scott Miller. Did a little more research and saw he was going to be at a writers' conference in San Diego, like in a month or something. So I sent, you could send in like 10 pages of your work, and I went to meet him. And at the time, I suffered from really, really, really bad social anxiety, which I don't anymore, just because, you do 1,000 things in public and go on TV and stuff like that. It's hard to keep up that level of anxiety.
Yeah, it's more. I mean, I'm Jew, right? So I'm anxious by nature, and it's like it becomes a job, and keeping up with the constant.
Exactly.
You got to just fucking let it go. Just let it go.
Same thing as like flying. I used to have a fear of flying. Put me in a couple hundred airplanes a year, the fear of flying goes away. Not because anything's changed, other than it's like, that's just exhausting to be so damn like freaked out. So I had this social anxiety thing, and I was actually supposed to meet with 3 agents and that I'd sent it to, including the one who was my first choice. And the first 2, I didn't even leave my hotel room. I just paced and called myself a piece of shit for not going. I was just too scared. And the third one, I was like, man, you flew all the way to California. You spent all this money that you don't have. And, this is the guy you want. And I went to see him, and he said, "You're Mark Greaney." I was like, "Yeah." And he said, "Man, you're the guy."
Said your last name correctly?
No, probably not. No, actually not for years. My agent got that a few years later. And he said, "You're the guy I've been waiting to see," because he'd gotten my 10 pages. And
oh, wow.
He said, "This is the best thing that's ever been given to me at a writer's conference." And then he said, not that that's saying a lot, which is kind of, faint praise. But then he asked me to talk more about the story, and you could kind of see his eyes glaze over. And he's like, "Yeah, it's probably not the book for someone that no one's heard of or whatever." But he's like, "You write great action, a cool story if you wrote something, he kind of gave me not really ideas, but it's just like, if you wrote a book where you could have a guy on the cover with a gun in his hand, that book would sell because you're that good at action. So I took that 5-minute or 10-minute speed dating conversation, and I went away and I wrote a whole book, and it took me, most of a year because obviously I was working and other stuff. And with that book, he read it, and then he called me up. He's like, I'm not going to tell you what you want to hear. He said, I think this is a good book. There's probably a lot of agents that would represent this, but I think you can do better. He said, I like your hero. I like this subplot. And if you took away the main plot of the book, which isn't that interesting, and turn that subplot into the main, he's like, it's not just a reworking of the book. You need a whole nother book.
Yeah.
And then so he finished that. And I remember thinking at the time, I was like, let's go back to where you said there were agents that would handle this. It's like, give me a name. But he was right. And I spent a day crying into my beer. And then I started working on my fourth novel, which was Gray Man. And that's the one that was ultimately published. That agent is my agent to this day. So.
Well, let me first, I don't know if anyone does, but let me first pat you on the back, because to me, failure fucking sucks. And, for you to go back literally to square one, that takes a lot of chutzpah. That takes a lot.
Yeah. Yeah. So, and again, for a fourth time to go back to try and get published. But, I've had like virtually no epiphanies in my life. I'm not one of those navel gazing people or whatever, but I absolutely did have an epiphany at one point when I was in my late 30s and I was having no success, and I was writing in my free time, and my rest of my life was in the shitter. And you told me I could cuss at the beginning, and now I'm like afraid that the next podcast I do, I'm gonna.
That's why people like this podcast. That's why authors like coming on this podcast.
Right. All right. Yeah. But I feel like you're priming the pump, and I'm gonna do another podcast later today, and I'm gonna get in trouble. Anyway, what was I saying? It had a bad word in it, but yeah. So I felt like I love to write. The epiphany was, okay, my brain loves working on stories, and it's when I'm walking my dog or whatever, it's just when I'm driving to work, it's like my brain likes to think about, like, so what if the assassin was actually Romanian and not Russian, and they or just whatever crazy thing. And that's where my brain liked to reside. And when I sit there and write and things are flowing and going well, it's how it is. It's a great feeling. So I was like, okay, you do this for free. Stop freaking out about not being successful at it or whatever. And within 2 years, I had a book deal, and within 4 years, I was writing with Clancy, and I had a movie deal within a couple years, so I really give a lot of credit to that moment where I just said, dude, relax. Don't look at these things as bad. And even when my agent, or the guy that ended up being my agent, he wasn't my agent when he told me no. When he said that, after, like I said, crying into my beer, I was like, well, I have fallen, but I have fallen forward. He's given me new information. I finished this book. He said it was probably good enough to get published, but I could do better. I was like, all right. I'm not succeeding, but my level of failure is getting better and better. If that makes any sense. Yeah.
I'm just stoked. I'm stoked to hear you say that, because I think more people need to hear that. I'm the kind of person where again, like, I write because I love to write.
Right.
I do this podcast because I love financial gain has nothing to do with any of this stuff. At the end of the day, it's something I love to do, but also it is it can be emotionally draining. I got 2 more rejections last week for a short story I submitted. Like it's never fun. My question to you though is, hearing all this, are you happy that the success that you would eventually find? Are you happy that it kind of came to later in life as opposed to if you were 22?
Oh, that is a very emotional question for me, because I'm not happy because my dad, who was incredible supporter of me, never got to read a damn thing that I wrote. And my mom actually passed away after I'd gotten the agent, after the agent said he would represent me, but before I had a book deal. So neither of my parents saw any of this. And that makes me very, very sad, because Not because I had anything to prove to my parents or anything like that. Just
Sure.
this ride would have been so much more fun if my dad was along with me, just to marvel over, like, wow, you just went up to Tom Clancy's house in Baltimore and talked about, Chinese tanks. It's like,
I'm sure somewhere he's stoked for you.
yeah, and people say that, and that actually does help.
Yeah.
But I look back on it, and there was no reason that I couldn't have been published before 30, except in the back of my head, I didn't really believe that happened to normal people. I thought that was just this. It's just like this imaginary thing, and that's one of the things when I speak to authors who haven't been published yet. I'll see them at conferences, or I've taught a couple online classes, and I'm always like, now I've been on both sides of this. I've been at the writers conference where I'm at the table where everybody's trying to finish their first book or come up with an idea, and now I'm at the table with like the biggest writers in the country or whatever, and it's like same people, exact same people. There's not this qualitative difference in the people, or this rarefied. Now some people are douchebags, obviously. With it, success in anything makes some people a douchebag, but very, very few. And I always tell authors, like, I didn't have the guts to walk up to Lisa Gardner or Lee Child or somebody and introduce myself and say I was working on something. But I've seen people do it now that I know them and stuff like that, and they're the most approachable people in the world. And if I'd had more of that when I was younger, and known somebody who was an author, or know somebody who knew somebody who was an author, or if I've gone to conferences and met them, I would have realized it's not for this elite like person. It's just for somebody that just keeps their nose down, stays in the trenches, writes, and gets their shit done. And good things will come to that. So that's my big takeaway, is that, like, it's not, you're not a more special person when you've been published. I'm super proud of something that I wrote that was rejected by everybody and never got published. I'm very proud of that. So when I meet somebody who hasn't been published yet, I don't think, well, I'm probably a better author than him. It's like, no, I think I nailed something and got rejected by everybody. J.K. Rowling got rejected. Just think, if you're the editor that said no to that, what your reputation is at the publishing house. So, rejection's part of it, unfortunately.
Oh yeah. Yeah, no, I mean, this is everything you're saying, I mean, rings true certainly with me, because again, I'm coming at it from the same way you're coming at it. I didn't go to, the school and get the MFA and get the Iowa Writer Workshop, and that's all good. That's great.
Yeah.
But there are channels into this world that people can take.
Right.
It sounds like you took a different channel. I mean, you literally came at it, I call it ass backwards. I'm a guy who's coming at it ass back. In my mind, the publishing world doesn't really want a writer like me, but maybe they do, because, again, it's so, like you said, when you meet the people on the other side of the curtain, they're just people.
That's a great way of putting it.
Yeah. So can you go back to when that first book popped? What was that like? How did that happen? What, did it all happen really quick? The Gray Man, what was that like?
Well, fortunately, I have a wonderful editor who's been my editor from the beginning. His name is Tom Colgan. And there was a part of my career where it was all falling apart, and he never told me. And I didn't find out about it until everything was fine later, that things were kind of going down the tubes. It's kind of funny. But my first book sold to Hollywood before it came out. So it was just released as a paperback, a mass market paperback. So it was a very small book deal. They're smaller, but it wasn't nothing.
Can you explain the difference between that and, say, a traditional book deal?
Well, I'm just talking about the amount of money. I mean,
okay. It
wasn't released as a hardcover. It wasn't released as a trade paperback, which is the larger, nicer paperback. It was released as like an airplane. Which I was obviously thrilled. I was like really happy to be published, and it's just like that. Your goal in life is to like hold that thing in your hands that you made, and that was everything that you would think it would be. Actually, in the digital age, the thing was, I remember, if I'm going long, just tell me. I remember watching my nephew, who was about 3 years old, and I got an email from the publisher, and they're like, here's our idea for the artwork for the book. And of course, I'd never seen my name like on a cover. This wasn't physical yet. It was still like they were asking. And I just remember I was like, oh my gosh, I'm going to double click on this and I'm going to see myself as a writer. And I was just like, my heart was just pounding. And I opened it and I saw, Mark Greaney, the Gray Man, and the cover art and everything like that. And there was nobody else there but my nephew. So like I'm sitting there, I'm holding him as he's trying to go play, and trying to convey to him that this is a book. He wasn't getting it at all. But it's like I needed somebody to like be there with me and like and to dig that. And so that was the first thing. But when the book came out, I sold a book deal to New Regency, which I looked at it at the time as great talking point when you do your little radio interviews. And I just basically did local stuff for my first couple of books. And to go out there and say, yeah, Hollywood just picked up the option to this is a great thing. You've come out of nowhere. Mm-hmm. You have this paperback book that nobody's heard of. Nobody's heard of you. It was just a little feather in the cap. It was, I gave it 0.000% chance that it was ever going to, be made into a film. And that's a good thing because you don't get your hopes dashed. And then the book came out, and the first book sold pretty well. The second book didn't sell well at all. And I don't think it wasn't a quality thing. I think it was just the first book got a certain amount of attention from independent bookstores. It was on a list of like best books that were read by some big shots in the independent bookstores. I probably had that all wrong, but something along those lines. And the second one didn't get that pop. And I turned in the third one because I had a 3-book deal. Well, I had a 1-book deal, and they turned that into 2 more books. So I turned in the third one, and I hadn't heard anything from my editor for like weeks, and I was freaking out. So I called my agent, and I'm not one of those guys that calls his agent freaking out very often. And I said, "Is this bad? Is this bad?" And he called Tom, my editor, and Tom's like, "Yeah, no, I'm just working on something else. I'll get back with him." And then I found out what that something else was. Is that my agent called me one day and said, "Are you sitting down?" I was like, "Yeah." And he's like, "Do you want to write a Jack Ryan novel with Tom Clancy?" And my initial thought was exactly the opposite of what most people would think, or what most people think they would think. I was just like, "Oh shit, no!" It's like I was terrified. I was terrified of that prospect, because it's like, how many eyeballs are going to be on me now? And I was still dealing with the social anxiety to some degree. I'd done some public stuff, and I baked my way through it. But like I'd sweat a lot. I was taking medicine to where I wouldn't sweat too much, and of course the medicine makes it where you have no saliva in your mouth, so I couldn't talk either. But at least I wasn't like dripping sweat while I was on TV. I was going through all that, and I remember thinking in those few seconds before I answered him, I was like, I don't want to do this. I want to run. I want to hang the phone up and run as far away, even though I was a massive Clancy fan. And once I settled down, it's like, who better than me? Not that I'm the best, but I knew that stuff inside and out because I love those books. And I just realized my agent would never speak to me again if I said, "No, I'm okay. I don't really want to do a Tom Clancy book." So I did one. I co-wrote a book with him, and then we co-wrote 2 more. And the third one came out right after he passed away in 2013. And then the family immediately hired me to continue the Jack Ryan series. So I ended up writing 7 in 6 years, and it was the best experience. It made me a better writer. It changed the texture of my Gray Man novels and made them a little bit bigger. And that's how I went from paperback writer who's was selling less for the second book and less for the third book to getting that jolt. It didn't totally change your career. You work twice as hard, if not more, and you get 1,000 times more criticism. When you're working with Clancy and you're writing Clancy and you're not Clancy, they're 30% of the people are going to hate you without having read a word of the book. So I had to deal with that. That was all a little, a lot to take early on, but I look back on it and it was like, it was the best thing for my career in every possible way. I tell people there was nothing I could do publicity wise to promote my Gray Man stories than to write a Jack Ryan novel every year. I mean, there's nothing, have my name on the cover of a Jack Ryan novel. So
I got a couple of questions. First, again, part of my ignorance on this, is it common for authors like Tom Clancy to write with other authors? Is that something that happens frequently in that genre, or with those?
Yeah, more so. basically these authors become a brand name, and
Yeah.
a cover of a book is they want to do artwork or something to make people see that book and pay attention to that book. And you could have a black book that says Tom Clancy on it, and somebody sees that and they know exactly what type of story that is. They know that they're in for this ride, and so authors become a brand name. So sometimes, I mean, there's a lot of authors who do that, and I have a lot of friends that write for Clive Cussler or for the Robert Ludlum estate or whatever. And it some people don't like it. They think the book should die with the author. But then the counter to that is people who love Robert Ludlum want to see what Jason Bourne is doing in 2020 with this technology and this sort of stuff. And as long as the author didn't put anything, I guess, in their will saying like, you can't touch my stuff, then I think, the family, obviously there's financial gain, but at the same time, I think there's a case to be made. My buddy, Josh Hood, is writing for the Robert Ludlum estate, and Josh is a badass writer. He's
Come on the podcast. You have him on?
You should have Josh on. He's a fun guy. He's awesome. He's hit the 82nd Airborne and 101st Airborne. Just cool dude. He was a SWAT sniper here in Shelby County, Tennessee, where I live.
Yeah, for sure.
And he's a young guy. He used to, like, we're buddies, and he would just always like tease me about like, well, I'm not a #1 New York Times best-selling author, so I don't get to say that the way you do. And I'm like, well, I'm not 34, you asshole. It's just like, I'll take the years and you can take the career.
Yeah.
But he's doing great. And I'm glad that he's getting those eyeballs on his work.
Yeah.
And I'm sure the Ludlum estate is thrilled because he's a good writer. And I'm sure the people that read those novels are like, wow, here's a different voice telling, this story, but it's quality, the quality's there, and that really should be all that matters.
And correct me if I'm wrong, but I immediately draw a comparison to the comic book world. Batman doesn't die because, like Superman doesn't stop being written. Like, am I wrong in saying that? Like, comic books continue to get written. The characters are still there, but they're being written and drawn by other people all the time.
Same thing. The James Bond films, it's
okay,
like,
great. Yeah.
Ian Fleming died in 1964, I think. I think they were, somewhere close to there.
Yeah.
And those are still coming out today.
Yeah.
So, and it's, people say like, you write this series, you're in book 10 of the series, your hero's always in peril. How do you make the story interesting? Because people know he's not going to die because you're writing the series. And I'm like, nobody goes to a James Bond film expecting him to get, his throat slashed in the opening credits. I mean, it just doesn't make sense. You put skin in the game in other places and you make it exciting.
Well, thanks for clearing that up, at least for me. Next question. It's a two-part question. Again, I'm not too familiar with Tom Clancy's work, but if you're a human being in America or anywhere really, you at least know his name.
Yeah, absolutely.
Two-part question. A, do you remember the first time meeting him? And B, what was he like?
The first time meeting him it's a story I've told a bunch, and it's not my proudest moment, but it's kind of hilarious. It's kind of hilarious. So it's like, I'll take the kick in the ribs. I was going to meet him at his penthouse apartment in Baltimore. Totally nervous.
Was he a Baltimore guy?
What's that?
Was he a Baltimore guy?
Yeah.
Okay.
That area. Yeah. And so I went to meet him, and I had said something to my editor, and I was like, I feel like I should bring a gift, but like, what the hell do I have that Tom Clancy? What can I go get that Tom Clancy owns a tank? It's
what
like,
year is this?
This was 2011.
Oh, okay.
10 years ago, yeah. And about this time, a little bit after this. And I said, what can I bring him? And he's like, well, he has this lovely wife, Alex, and he did. She's a wonderful person. He's like, just bring her flowers. That would be the coolest thing you could do. And Tom, my editor, who'd been there to meet, to talk to Clancy many times, he's like, here's what happens. You'll get off the elevator. He's got the whole floor. So you ring the door. The housekeeper will answer. We'll take you into the kitchen. You'll meet Alex, or, somewhere, and then you'll be taken back into the lair where Clancy does his writing. And I was like, all right, cool. So I brought this big thing of flowers. I get up there, I knock on the door. I pace the street outside so I come in exactly at the right time. All these things like, oh shit. And the door opens and it's his housekeeper. And I was like, oh, just as Tom said. And I had this big thing of flowers. And she's like, oh, follow me. And I was like, cool, I'm going to go in the kitchen, meet Alex. She opens up a door. I go in the room and it's just Tom Clancy sitting behind his desk, all his military regalia, all his baseball caps, which he was known for wearing baseball caps of different ships and stuff, were there. And I'm standing there like a dumbass. And he just looked at me, he goes, you brought me flowers? and the only thing I could say was, I was like, I was told this was going to go down a little bit differently. So I sat there at the table, or, on the other side of his desk, and we talked for a couple of minutes, but literally a couple of minutes. And I was kind of like leaning around the bouquet, and finally he's like, let me get those. And he takes those into the kitchen, and then when Alex comes, his wife showed up a few minutes later, and that's why I didn't meet her first. He's like, yeah, he brought me flowers, and I'd already told him they were for her, but he was having fun with that. But yeah, so I've been warned that Clancy was a real gruff guy. I flew up there for like a 45-minute meet and greet, just sort of, somebody was joking, it's like to kiss the ring or something like that, and I was there in his house for 5 hours, and we ate lunch, and we had a really great time. We talked about things other than the books, and I had to go get on a plane because my flight was it was literally supposed to have been like 11:45 to 12:30, and I was there till 5 p.m. or something like that. And so it was a really, really good experience. And he came away with the understanding that I knew his books and I knew him and I had an appreciation of him. And I came away with this, just even more feeling of how, large, how big this deal was, and it probably helped me in that regard too.
We won't harp too much on Tom Clancy, but since it's obviously something you're pretty comfortable talking with. At that point, by 2011, he's on the Mount Rushmore of this world, right? Who is even in his stratosphere at this point?
Well, they said in the 90s, Stephen King and Clancy were the biggest. To 2000s, it was a little less focused on techno thrillers, but every one of his books was number one when it came out, and so he's just about as big as they come. Yeah. Any author that's had four films made of his 14 books or however many books he had 12 books, he had four films. A TV series obviously has since come out. Another film has since come out. So he was a big deal. They're making a movie out of my first book, and it's a game changer. You feel this sort of incremental increase in your success, and then like Netflix puts Ryan Gosling in the lead role, and all this other stuff, and then suddenly you get attention at a different level. And Clancy was getting that at a time when his name and Stephen King and John Grisham, they were all sort of banded around together, and nobody else really.
Yeah. And again, he correct me if I'm wrong, he came into writing later in life as well, right?
Absolutely. Yeah, he was an insurance salesman with really, really, really bad vision, and wasn't able to get into the military, but had a love of that sort of thing. And then he wrote Hunt for Red October, pre-internet. So, he was writing letters to people to get details because he's very technical oriented, and he's reading Jane's Defense Weekly and all this, all these books or whatever to get information for his story. And a lot of that stuff now you can just research on the internet. And I do. I'll go to a military base, or I'll go to China or Russia or whatever. But at the end of the day, a lot of times you're just Googling stuff. And he did not have that luxury.
It sounds like he's a very technical writer in that sense. Are you the same as well? Are you very detail oriented in your writing?
Some people think so. Definitely less than Clancy. It's funny. There's in one of his books, The Sum of All Fears, a nuclear bomb goes off at the Super Bowl in Denver, and I'm not exaggerating. As I recall, from the moment that the timer goes down to zero to the moment the bomb detonates, I think it's somewhere between like 4 and 6 pages of this solenoid fired this, which made the fusion of the this and the this. And it goes on for 4 or 5 pages. And, my joke was, okay, I'm going to write the Clancy books, but if a scene like that comes up, I'm going to write boom. That's going to be the difference between my way of doing it and his. I do a lot of research with firearms. I do a lot of research with military and law enforcement and stuff like that. And I like to integrate that into the story because the Gray Man novels are over the top action, but it's my job to sell it to people anyway, so it doesn't matter that, this is really improbable. It's my job to make you believe it. So, I use like real tactics that SWAT guys use or real, ways that people halo jump or whatever, even, intricate bureaucracy things in the CIA, that's all important to get right. Because the next scene, you're going to have something so wackadoodle crazy happen that you don't want to have people not believe you.
Sure. Yeah. No, I asked that because I've had a couple of different authors who, write, I'll just use the blanket term, like, military fiction. Now that's probably not a real thing, but I'm just going to say that.
Yeah.
Elliot Ackerman, Phil Clyde, things like that. And they had a different approach when I asked that question. Are you talking about the caliber of the bullet, the grain of the, I think Jack Carr is another author who's super into like,
sure,
looking through that scope, dialing into this metric and things like that, which can bore some people to fucking death. But I've seen the people who like your work like that stuff too, right? You're writing for an audience.
Yeah, it's a balance. It is a balance because, you're always trying to get new readers, and not every reader cares that it's a 147 grain boat tail, 308 round traveling at a, 2,700 feet per second initial muzzle velocity. I mean, but I usually say what type of weapon it is or why they're using that or something like that. So it's definitely in there, but a lot of it comes out when I'm editing. I'm like, okay, you have to be really careful as a writer to not, if you're sort of do a lot of research, to not use the research just because it was a pain in the ass to learn it and you wanted somebody to damn well know that you went to do the work. And that was early in my career. I had to edit out a lot of that stuff later, and I'd be like, okay, I'm just going into all this detail because I had to read this big fucking book, and I had to get something out of it. Whereas now I'll do research and it never makes its way into the story. But if it doesn't serve the story, it shouldn't be there.
Well, but to me, I'm at the tail end of finishing my first novel. It's about a fictional rock and roll band in the late '90s, early 2000s.
Yeah.
And I'm the same way. I talk about the guitars, I talk about the amps, but I don't want to be nauseating about it.
Right.
But at the same time, it's like I want anyone who's ever stepped on stage or been in a van or whatever to immediately connect with that and kind of, on an emotional level.
Absolutely. And to give yourself the credibility for them to believe what's happening. Like Jack Carr is a friend of mine, and he writes incredibly detailed stuff. But to me, it doesn't detract from the story because it's that kind of a story, and people pick it up for that reason. And he was a sniper, and he was enlisted and an officer in the Navy SEALs. And, he's establishing his bona fides every time he does something like that. So it is a balance and a trade-off. And I do the research with the guns, and so I want people to hear things that they wouldn't necessarily hear in other books, like that you can actually feel the overpressure of a bullet passing by your face. It actually has this like scary feeling of like just the gases and the movement of the air around you as it whizzes past you at 2,700 feet a second. And you don't hear that in a lot of books, or you'll get little bits of gunpowder if somebody fires near you, kind of peppering your body. And so you put things like that in there to be like, okay, this makes this a real moment.
And I mean, in that research, half the time I find the best Wikipedia articles and YouTube videos by doing random research. If I'm researching, I have to make sure an album came out in a certain year. And then I'm like, well, what was the biggest hit of that year? And you click on that, and then 30 minutes go by, and it'll never end up in the book. But now it's like, I can do a podcast a year from now, and for some that'll be in my head, and I'll be able to pull that out.
But I mean, that's what makes, that's a writer's brain. You go down that rabbit hole, and it might not end up in your book, but that's where your brain likes to know this and to know that. And it's the same way. My new book that's just coming out, Relentless, takes place in Berlin, my plan was to rent an apartment in a kind of a seedier part of Berlin and live there for 6 weeks or something like that. COVID, I couldn't do it. I've been to Germany many times. I lived in Cologne for a short time, and I speak some German, and so I was able to use a lot of, you know, old notes from other books I've researched there or whatever. But you know, I love that location research. It really adds to the credibility in the story.
Yeah. So I mean, you step into that Tom Clancy universe. I mean, you know, how do you go about now producing new works? I mean, are you in both roles at the same time? Or how do you do that? How do you juggle that?
Well, I continued doing a Gray Man book every year and a Clancy book every year until the end of 2016, and I stepped away from Clancy. And then I've still done 2 books a year some of the years since by doing other things. I wrote a big, large-scale military thriller with a then active duty Marine Lieutenant Colonel who was a friend of mine called Red Metal, and that came out in 2019. Doing a sequel to that. I wrote an original audio drama, which is where they hire actors and do sound effects and music and everything to act out sort of an audio play. And Audible is recording that.
That's dope. Month. I never heard it. Is that a new kind of thing?
It's a pretty new thing, and it's not, you know, I don't think it's, I think it's going to surprise people. It's going to be probably about a 5-hour, you know, audio film, you know, play where they hire up to 40 actors, and it takes place in Mexico. They're actually recording some of it in Mexico City, and they're doing sound effects and all that. It's an action, but I've actually sold that. Go ahead.
I'm sorry, I'm long on audio format. You're already starting to see it. There's this new app called Clubhouse that I don't know if you heard of it. It's like an invite-only thing, but it's all audio. You know, Elon Musk is going on there just talking. You know, I'm big on the audio, so that's really cool. Well, I'm sorry, what was the technical name of it? What did you say it was called?
Gosh, I call it an audio play. Yeah.
Play. Okay.
Yeah. So it's just differentiate. It's not them reading a novel. It's them acting out a novel or whatever. But that story, I sold the option. I optioned that in Hollywood to Michael Bay and Erwin Stoff, and I'm writing a novel version of that audio play as well. So I do a Gray Man book and I do something else. I do a Gray Man book. I do something else. And I keep telling myself I'm not going to keep doing this, but I feel like I've got like 6 books in the hopper, one after the other.
Well, I got to ask the obvious question. You said it took you 15 years plus to write your first book. How do you write 2 books in a year now?
I do them in 6 months, and it's not a straight 6 months. Basically, I'm writing a book now, and I'm thinking of the next book. That's usually the way it was. I was having trouble with the book that I needed to start writing. So I just told myself, all right, stop writing the other book and spend as much time as you need to come up with a decent synopsis of this book, just so you're not freaking out that you've got nothing for the thing down the road. So, you know, it took me a while. It took me most of a month to come up with like a 15-page detailed synopsis. But once I had it, I'm like, whew, okay, now I know what the next book is. I can go back to this book. It's not easy. It's not a long-term thing, but even though I've been doing it for 10 years, you know, you pay a price for it. I mean, it definitely helps your career because it gets your name out there a couple of times. If you're hitting the Times list twice a year, it's a good, you know, it's a good thing for you. But I have nothing to prove to anybody, so it's not going to keep happening. I just have these ideas for stories, and and I feel like part of it is that, you know, I was told no so many times and wanted to be an author for so long. It's like, it's hard to say no to anything these days.
Yeah. So what does the future hold for you? What's the immediate thing? What's going on right now?
Well, I'm promoting Relentless, and they start shooting the Netflix film for my first book, The Gray Man, in March.
Is that crazy? I mean, this book you wrote
12 years ago.
I mean, is that crazy that it's coming, that's the book that's being made into all this? I mean,
well, it's the origin. I mean, it's the first in the series, and they want to, if the Russo brothers are the directors and wrote the screenplay, and they want to make it as a franchise. They've got Chris Evans and Ryan Gosling and you know, a lot of other big names in it, Ana de Armas, and they have, you know, it's coming out on Netflix, but they have high expectations for it. And I never believed for a second. It got close to shooting back in 2012 with Brad Pitt, and it was kind of like, oh my gosh, this might happen. And then that fell through, and after that it's like, well, I'll take the money for the options, but I don't think it's ever going to happen. And, you know, I'll talk the talk, but you know, I doubt any studio will ever make it. And then in July of this year, Sony made a deal with Netflix and Ryan Gosling signed on. I'd heard rumors about it, but I'd heard rumors about so many things over 12 years, I didn't even talk about it. So yeah, it's surreal, but I'm still the author. And to me, the film is like the best advertisement possible for my book series. And it's a different medium, and I'm not an expert on film, so they're going to do their thing. I'm going to keep doing my thing over here.
What do you think the dude back then would think about what's happening right now to you? How do you think he would have handled it when you were writing those pages when no one knew who the hell you were?
Yeah. I guess it probably would have freaked me out. It's a dream, and a lot of times dreams don't come true, but this one, to this day, I keep telling people like this whole thing is going to fall apart, and they're like, no, they've already built sets in Long Beach, and all these actors are signed on and everything. I'm like, yeah, but I've seen defeat snatched from the jaws of victory before. But it looks pretty good. COVID delayed it by like 6 weeks, but it's not like the actors are going to go shoot something else, I don't think. So it's surreal, and the me from 13 years ago just wanted to hold a paperback book with my name on it in his hands, so I didn't have big aspirations. I didn't even know I was writing a series until the publisher said, can you do 2 more? And they tell you it's a series, and that's pretty much how that goes.
Well, maybe 12 years from now, I'll be sitting where you're sitting. That would be pretty dope.
Yeah, I hope so. Yeah, and you'll be younger than me when you do it.
Mark, this has been an absolute pleasure, man. Thanks for taking the time to talk to us.
Yeah, I had a lot of fun.
Yeah, I always ask 2 questions at the end. First off, I think are you a social media guy? Do you do Twitter, Instagram, Facebook?
Yeah, I'm all over everything. It's Mark Greaney Books. It's Greaney. It's Mark Greaney Books, and then on Twitter, it's Mark Greaney Book, singular. But I'm on Facebook and Instagram. I've got a website, markgraineybooks.com.
Dope. And the last question, I know you're a Tennessee guy. What bookstores do you rep? Where should people be buying your books from?
Oh, thanks for asking. Novel Bookstore in Memphis, Tennessee. It's an independent bookstore here. It's 5 minutes from my house. So they have if you go to their website, they have a link where you can actually pre-order this book, and they will, I'll come up there and sign it and personalize it or whatever. There's great bookstores all over the country, Poison Pen in Scottsdale, Arizona, Murder by the Book in Houston. It's like, I try to get people to buy independent when they can, because I think that's a great thing, but I hope you find it somewhere.
Mark, thanks so much, man.
Hey, I appreciate it. This is a lot of fun.
Yeah, most definitely. Enjoy the rest of your day.
You too.
All right, bye-bye.
Bye.